Chapter 1. Whispers of a Sunlit Dawn. The morning unfurled slowly, as if hesitant to disturb the stillness of the sleeping world. The first rays of sunlight stretched tender fingers over the rooftops, painting them in hues of amber and gold. A gentle breeze stirred the curtains of an old townhouse, its movement delicate, almost reverent, as though it feared waking the solitude that had settled there for so long. Inside, a lone figure lingered by the window, her silhouette outlined by the soft glow of dawn. Isabelle had always loved this hour, the fleeting moment when the world balanced on the cusp of waking and dreaming. She pressed her hand to the cool glass, her breath forming a faint mist that quickly disappeared. The garden below was still, each leaf trembling as the morning breeze whispered secrets to them. Years of habit had taught her to cherish the small things. The muted hum of life stirring outside, the quiet rhythm of her own heartbeat, and the soft creak of floorboards as she moved through the house. It was an ancient home, its walls steeped in stories no one alive could tell. The wooden stairs sighed under her weight as she descended, each step a reminder of the countless mornings she greeted in silence. The kitchen smelled faintly of lavender, a scent she had cultivated over time with sachets tucked into every corner. A steaming cup of tea sat on the counter, the water still swirling as if reluctant to settle. Isabelle carried it to the table by the window, the one where sunlight always fell just right. She didn't drink it immediately. Instead, she cradled the warmth in her hands, letting her gaze drift to the garden. It had been years since she'd last tended it with care, but still, wildflowers grew among the tangles. Lavender, daisies, and the occasional rose bloomed defiantly against the overgrowth. A robin hopped along the stone path, its crimson breast vivid against the muted greens and browns of the earth. Isabelle often wondered how such a small creature could carry so much life, its every movement a dance, its song a hymn to the morning. Her thoughts wandered to the years before, a time when her mornings had been filled with laughter that echoed through the halls, footsteps rushing to meet her own, and the warmth of another presence beside her. Time had a way of stealing such things, leaving only fragments behind. The faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air, the forgotten crease of a smile etched into her memories. Outside, the sun climbed higher, casting light on the world and banishing the shadows. Isabelle rose, the faintest trace of a smile on her lips. She stepped into the garden, her bare feet brushing against the dew-kissed grass. The air was cool but carried the promise of warmth, as if the day itself was inviting her to rediscover what she had left untouched for so long. She knelt by a patch of lavender, her hands brushing the soil as she pulled away the weeds that had taken root. It was slow work, and her fingers ached, but she didn't stop. Each pull felt like reclaiming a piece of herself that had been lost. The robin chirped nearby, its song a steady companion. Hours passed before she stood again, her palms smudged with dirt, her knees damp from the earth. But the garden looked different now, alive, cared for. A single butterfly flitted past her, its wings catching the sunlight like stained glass. Isabelle watched it go, her heart swelling with an unfamiliar lightness. The day unfolded around her, but she didn't rush to meet it. She lingered in the garden, savoring the gentle rhythm of life. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like a pause, a breath before something beautiful could begin. And as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Isabelle allowed herself to hope that this might be the dawn of something new. The whispers of the morning still echoed in her mind, a promise carried on the wind that tomorrow would be different, brighter. Perhaps it was foolish to believe. But then again, wasn't hope always the most beautiful kind of foolishness? Chapter 2. Petals on the Edge of Winter. The days passed in a quiet rhythm, each one layered with moments of rediscovery. The garden had begun to transform under Isabelle's care, shedding its wild tangles to reveal small pockets of order and beauty. Yet, the air carried the crisp bite of approaching winter, and the sun's light grew thinner with each passing afternoon, casting long shadows over the world she was beginning to revive. The first frost arrived unannounced, frosting the garden with a delicate glaze. It was early morning when Isabelle noticed it, the sharp chill in the air coaxing her outside. The grass crunched softly beneath her boots, and her breath formed ghostly clouds that drifted skyward. The lavender wore a crystalline coat, its vibrant purple muted beneath a shimmer of white. She moved carefully through the garden, mindful of the fragile blooms that remained. Her fingers brushed against a lone rose, its petals still defiant against the cold. It had been the last to bloom that season, and Isabelle felt an odd kinship with it, a quiet resilience that had no need for words. The stone path beneath her feet was slick with ice, each step a small act of balance. At the far end of the garden, a weathered bench waited beneath an ancient oak tree. It had been a favorite spot of hers once, long ago when life had felt simpler and the weight of loss had yet to settle in her chest. Now, it felt like an unspoken challenge, a place she wasn't sure she was ready to face. But she went anyway, drawn by some unseen thread. The bench creaked softly as she sat, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat. The oak's bare branches stretched upward, etched starkly against the pale sky. A single leaf clung stubbornly to the highest branch, fluttering with each gust of wind but refusing to let go. Isabelle watched it for a long time, her thoughts drifting like the clouds overhead. Winter had always held a strange beauty for her. It was a season of endings, of things retreating into themselves to endure the harshness of the cold. But it was also a time of quiet strength, of unseen growth beneath the surface. The garden would sleep soon, its blooms replaced by frost and bare earth. Yet Isabelle found comfort in knowing it would awaken again come spring, reborn in a cycle older than memory. Her gaze fell to the patch of soil at her feet, where tiny shoots of greenery had begun to emerge despite the frost. They were snowdrops, their delicate white buds braving the cold before any other flower dared to rise. She leaned forward, her breath warming the air around them, as if her presence alone could shield them from the chill. Memories surfaced unbidden, sharp and vivid against the backdrop of the garden. She remembered hands other than hers tending these same flowers, roughened by work but gentle in their touch. The laughter that had once filled this space seemed to echo faintly in the stillness, a reminder of what had been and what could never be again. But this morning, the ache felt softer, less like a wound and more like a scar, a mark of something endured. Isabelle straightened, her fingers brushing against the frost-coated arm of the bench. The garden had seen so much, held so many moments within its borders. It felt like a companion now, its silence filled with an understanding she couldn't find elsewhere. The hours slipped by unnoticed as she worked, clearing fallen leaves and cutting back the withered stems of summer's flowers. The cold bit at her fingers, turning them red, but she welcomed the sting. It was proof that she was alive, that she could still feel. As the sun dipped lower, casting the garden in hues of gold and silver, Isabelle paused to admire her work. The snowdrops stood like sentinels, their fragile beauty a promise that life persisted even in the coldest of seasons. She lingered a moment longer, her breath misting in the twilight air. The house loomed behind her, its windows glowing faintly with the warmth of firelight. For the first time in years, she felt no rush to retreat within its walls. Instead, she allowed herself to savor the fading light, the crisp air, and the quiet companionship of a garden that seemed to echo her own transformation. By the time she returned indoors, her hands were trembling from the chill, but her heart felt steady, as if something within her had shifted. She poured herself a cup of tea, the warmth spreading through her palms as she carried it to the window. Outside, the frost glistened beneath the first stars of evening, each crystal catching the light like a secret waiting to be discovered. Isabelle sipped her tea slowly, her eyes fixed on the snowdrops standing tall in the garden's embrace. In their quiet defiance of winter's grasp, she saw a reflection of her own journey, a delicate strength blooming on the edge of a season that sought to silence it. And for the first time, she wondered what might grow if she allowed herself to lean into that strength, to let the coming days shape her as gently and inexorably as the frost shaped the earth. Hope stirred faintly, a whisper against the silence, and Isabelle held it close as the night settled around her. Chapter 3. The Bridge Between Silences. The morning arrived veiled in mist, its soft edges blurring the world into shades of gray and silver. Isabelle stood at the threshold of the house, her breath forming clouds that dissolved into the damp air. The familiar outline of the garden was softened by the fog, each tree and bush transformed into a ghostly silhouette. It was a day for quiet reflection, for walking paths unseen and listening to the secrets the world might share. She pulled her coat tighter around her and stepped into the haze, her boots sinking slightly into the frost-kissed earth. The garden, though silent, felt alive with unspoken energy. Droplets of dew clung to every surface, glistening faintly like scattered jewels. As Isabelle moved, her presence disturbed the stillness, her footsteps leaving faint impressions in the grass. Beyond the garden's edge lay the field, a vast expanse of untamed nature bordered by a narrow creek. The creek had been a constant companion to her solitude, its gentle flow a soothing counterpoint to the quiet of the house. Today, the sound of its waters called to her, a low murmur that promised solace beneath the weight of the mist. The path to the creek was overgrown, its trail winding through tall grasses and brambles. Isabelle took her time, brushing aside branches and pausing to admire the small wonders hidden in the undergrowth. A cluster of mushrooms grew at the base of an oak tree, their caps gleaming faintly with moisture. Nearby, a spider's web stretched between two branches, its intricate design glistening with tiny droplets. When she reached the creek, the air seemed to hum with a quiet intensity. The water was dark and smooth, reflecting the pale sky above. A wooden bridge spanned the creek's narrowest point, its planks weathered by time and the elements. Isabelle hesitated before crossing, her hand brushing against the wooden railing as if seeking reassurance. The bridge had always been a place of transition, a threshold between the familiar and the unknown. It had been years since she'd ventured beyond it, the far side of the creek holding memories she hadn't been ready to face. But today, something within her urged her forward, a quiet voice that whispered of the importance of moving beyond the boundaries she had drawn for herself. She stepped onto the bridge, the wood creaking softly beneath her weight. Each step felt deliberate, a small act of courage against the pull of hesitation. The mist thickened as she crossed, obscuring the far bank until it seemed she was walking into an endless void. But the sound of the creek beneath her was steady, a constant reminder that the world continued to flow, even when unseen. When Isabelle reached the other side, the ground felt different beneath her feet, softer, untouched. The landscape opened into a meadow, its grasses swaying faintly despite the stillness of the air. The mist clung to everything, wrapping the meadow in a shroud of mystery. Isabelle felt a strange lightness as she moved forward, her steps unhurried, her thoughts untethered. The meadow held a strange beauty, its quietude broken only by the occasional rustle of unseen creatures. Isabelle wandered aimlessly, her fingers brushing against the tall grasses, the sensation grounding her in the present. Time felt irrelevant here, the moments stretching and folding in on themselves like ripples on the creek. At the meadow's center stood a lone willow tree, its branches hanging low and heavy with moisture. Isabelle approached it slowly, her breath catching at the sight of something unexpected. A small wooden swing, its ropes frayed but intact, swaying faintly in the still air. She paused beneath the tree, her hand resting lightly on the swing's weathered seat. It was a relic of a time long past, a remnant of someone else's story. Yet, it felt strangely familiar, as though it had been waiting for her all these years. Isabelle sat down carefully, her weight setting the swing into a gentle motion. The world around her seemed to fade as she swung, the rhythmic movement lulling her into a trance. Memories surfaced, unbidden and vivid. Laughter echoing through the meadow, hands entwined beneath the willow's branches, and the golden light of summer's long gone. A tear slipped down her cheek, its warmth startling against the cold. Isabelle let it fall, the act of release feeling like a bridge of its own, a connection between who she had been and who she was becoming. The mist began to lift as the afternoon wore on, the sun breaking through in soft rays that painted the meadow in shades of gold and green. Isabelle stood slowly, her hand lingering on the swing's rope as if to say goodbye. She turned back toward the creek, her steps steady and purposeful. Crossing the bridge felt different this time, the air lighter, the silence less heavy. When she reached the garden, the familiar sights greeted her like old friends. The snowdrops by the bench stood tall, their white petals glowing faintly in the afternoon light. Isabelle knelt beside them, her hands brushing the earth as if to reaffirm her connection to this place. As the day waned, Isabelle returned to the house, her heart quieter but fuller. The bridge and the meadow had left their mark, a subtle shift in the fabric of her being. She stood by the window, watching the last of the sunlight fade from the garden. There was no resolution, no grand revelation, just a quiet sense of movement, of progress made in small, silent steps. The bridge between silences had been crossed, and though the journey was far from over, Isabelle felt ready to take the next step, wherever it might lead. Chapter 4. A symphony of unspoken words. The wind carried a peculiar song that morning, a melody woven through the branches of trees and the tall grasses swaying at the garden's edge. Isabelle awoke to its quiet cadence, the faint rustle of leaves brushing against the stillness of the house. It was not a song made of music, but something deeper, a resonance that seemed to hum within her chest as she rose from her bed. She pulled her shawl around her shoulders, the wool soft against her skin, and made her way to the window. The garden stretched before her, touched by the pale light of dawn. Frost clung to the ground like a gossamer veil, shimmering faintly as the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds. Isabelle lingered there for a moment, letting the view settle into her like a familiar refrain. The kettle whistled in the kitchen, a sharp note cutting through the morning quiet. Isabelle moved through the house with practiced ease, her hands finding their place among the worn surfaces and familiar objects. The warmth of her tea seeped into her palms as she carried the cup to the garden, stepping carefully onto the frost-slicked path. The air was crisp, each breath a reminder of winter's approach. Isabelle followed the trail she had carved over the past weeks, her steps carrying her past the snowdrops, now dusted with frost, and the bench beneath the oak tree. The creek murmured in the distance, its voice a steady counterpoint to the wind's melody. Today, however, she felt drawn elsewhere. Her feet led her beyond the boundaries of the familiar garden, down a path she hadn't taken in years. The trail wound through a grove of birch trees, their pale trunks standing like silent sentinels. Here, the wind's song grew louder, its tones rising and falling as it moved through the branches. At the heart of the grove, she found a clearing she had almost forgotten. It was a place steeped in memory, its every detail etched into her heart even after all these years. The clearing was small, bordered by a low stone wall now covered in moss. In its center stood a weathered sundial, its surface inscribed with intricate carvings that time and the elements had softened but not erased. Isabelle stepped closer, her breath catching as her fingers traced the patterns on the sundial's face. She remembered the hands that had shaped it, the quiet afternoons spent watching the shadows move across its surface. It had been a gift once, given in a moment of love and shared silence. Now, it stood as a monument to something lost, yet enduring. The wind stirred around her, carrying with it the faint scent of cedar and earth. Isabelle closed her eyes, letting the moment wash over her. The unspoken words of the past seemed to rise like a symphony, each note resonating in the quiet of the clearing. It wasn't sadness she felt, but something deeper, an acknowledgement of all that had been and all that remained. She knelt beside the sundial, her hands brushing away the moss that had begun to claim its base. The work was slow, her fingers stiff from the cold, but she persisted. Each movement felt deliberate, a quiet offering to the memories held within this place. When she finished, the sundial stood clean and whole, its carvings glinting faintly in the light. Isabelle sat back on her heels, her breath clouding the air as she looked up at the sky. The sun was climbing higher now, its warmth breaking through the chill and casting soft shadows across the clearing. The symphony of the wind grew softer, its melody shifting as if to mark the passage of time. Isabelle rose slowly, her knees protesting the movement, and turned back toward the garden. The clearing would remain, its silence a song she could return to whenever she needed to remember. The path through the birch grove felt different on the way back, the trees less imposing, their pale trunks glowing faintly in the sunlight. By the time Isabelle reached the garden, the frost had begun to melt, leaving the grass damp and shining. She paused by the bench beneath the oak tree, her fingers brushing against the rough wood. The snowdrops swayed gently in the breeze, their white petals a quiet echo of the symphony she had felt in the clearing. As the day unfolded, Isabelle carried the memory of the wind's song with her. It lingered in the edges of her thoughts, a reminder that some things could never be fully expressed in words. The unspoken had its own language, one that resonated in the heart and endured through the quiet moments of life. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and violet, Isabelle sat by the window with her tea. The house was silent, but it no longer felt empty. The symphony of the day lingered in the air, a melody that needed no words to be understood. And as she watched the first stars appear, their faint light shimmering against the deepening sky, Isabelle felt a quiet sense of peace. The symphony of unspoken words would always be there, a part of her story, as enduring as the wind that carried it. Chapter 5, Where Shadows Hold Light. The wind carried the scent of change through the garden that morning, rich with the crispness of fallen leaves and the faint, earthy undertone of soil preparing for rest. Isabelle stood at the edge of the garden, her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders. Before her, the landscape stretched wide and wild, its colors shifting with the season's steady retreat into winter. The trees were in their final act, their leaves descending in a slow, deliberate cascade. Golds and russets fluttered to the ground like whispers, each one adding to the soft carpet that blanketed the garden paths. Isabelle watched their descent, her breath mingling with the cool air, her heart quiet and receptive to the moment's gentle rhythm. Her hands were tucked into gloves, though the cold still managed to seep through, making her fingers ache. Yet she welcomed the sensation. It was tangible, grounding her to the present in a way she hadn't felt in years. The garden had become a place of discovery, not just of its secrets, but of her own capacity to rebuild, to find meaning in the small, persistent acts of tending and care. She moved to the stone wall at the garden's boundary, where the ivy clung stubbornly despite the season's decay. The wall had always intrigued her, its uneven stones a patchwork of history and nature's slow reclamation. Today, she traced the vines with her fingers, noting the frost that outlined each leaf like a delicate sketch. Beyond the wall, the creek murmured faintly, its voice softer now as the flow slowed with the cooler temperatures. The meadow beyond the creek was a palette of muted tones, grays and browns that hinted at dormancy rather than death. Isabelle found beauty in its stillness, a quiet promise that life lingered beneath the surface, waiting for its time to return. The task for the day was clear in her mind: to clear the fallen leaves from the garden's paths and beds, ensuring the soil beneath them could breathe through the winter. She fetched the rake from the shed, its handle smooth from years of use, and began her work. The sound of the rake against the leaves was a soft, rhythmic rasp, a counterpoint to the occasional cry of a bird overhead. As she worked, Isabelle found herself attuned to the leaves themselves. Each one seemed to hold a story, its veins like tiny maps etched into its surface. Some were brittle, crumbling at her touch, while others were still pliant, their colors vibrant even in their descent. She imagined the journey they had taken, from buds unfurling in spring to full, green canopies in summer, and now, to this gentle surrender. The hours slipped by as she moved through the garden, her body finding a steady rhythm in the work. Piles of leaves grew at the edges of the beds, their rich hues forming mounds that seemed almost alive. Isabelle paused occasionally to admire the patterns they created, the way the sunlight caught their edges and cast faint shadows on the ground. At one point, she knelt by a bed of roses, now stripped of their blooms, their thorny branches bare against the sky. Beneath them, the soil was dark and rich, a testament to the life that continued unseen. Isabelle reached down to clear the leaves that had gathered there, her gloves brushing against the earth. As she worked, a memory surfaced, a vivid flash of a younger version of herself, crouched in this very spot, her hands bare as they dug into the soil. There had been laughter then, the kind that bubbled up from the heart and filled the air with warmth. She could almost hear it now, faint and fleeting, like the echo of a dream. The ache that accompanied the memory was familiar, but it no longer felt overwhelming. It was softer, like the sound of the creek in the distance, persistent but gentle, a reminder of what had been without overshadowing what could be. By the time Isabelle finished her work, the garden was transformed. The paths were clear, their stone edges defined once more, and the beds lay ready for the quiet months ahead. She stood back to admire her efforts, her breath rising in soft clouds as she exhaled. The sun was dipping low in the sky now, casting long shadows that stretched across the garden. The light caught on the piles of leaves, turning them to gold and amber. Isabelle smiled faintly, the sight filling her with a quiet satisfaction. She gathered the piles into a wheelbarrow, her movements steady despite the fatigue that had begun to settle into her limbs. The compost heap at the garden's edge welcomed the offering, its earthy scent rising faintly as she added the leaves to its embrace. When the last pile was cleared, Isabelle leaned on the handle of the rake, her gaze drifting to the sky. The first stars were beginning to appear, faint pinpricks of light against the deepening blue. The air was cold now, sharp against her skin, but she lingered, her heart full in a way that words could not capture. The garden, with its layers of decay and renewal, had become a mirror of her own journey. Each fallen leaf, each bare branch spoke of endings that held the promise of beginnings. The language of the garden was unspoken, but Isabelle was learning to understand it, to hear its quiet truths in the rustle of leaves and the whisper of the wind. As she returned to the house, her hands chilled and her body weary, Isabelle felt a sense of completeness. The garden was ready for winter, and so, she realized, was she. The The season of stillness was not an ending but a pause, a space in which to gather strength and prepare for what lay ahead. Inside, the warmth of the fire welcomed her, its light casting flickering shadows on the walls. Isabelle sat by the window with her tea, her gaze returning to the garden. The night had claimed it now, but she knew it would be there in the morning, waiting to continue its quiet conversation with her. And as the fire crackled softly and the stars wheeled above, Isabelle felt a deep sense of peace, the kind that comes from understanding the beauty of letting go. The language of falling leaves had spoken to her, and she had listened, finding in their quiet descent a reflection of her own strength and resilience. Chapter 6. Through the veil of a crimson sky. The frost came overnight, transforming the world into a crystalline dream. When Isabelle awoke, the light filtering through the window was sharper, brighter, as though the air itself had been polished. She rose slowly, the chill of the morning creeping through the floorboards and nipping at her feet. Pulling a heavy cardigan over her nightdress, she moved to the window and peered out at the garden. The landscape had been remade by the frost's delicate touch. Every leaf, every blade of grass, every bare branch was coated in a fine layer of ice, glinting in the early sunlight like spun glass. The garden seemed frozen in time, its stillness profound and all-encompassing. Even the creek, so constant in its murmuring, had quieted, its surface rimmed with a thin crust of ice that captured the light in fleeting rainbows. Isabelle stood there for a long time, her breath fogging the glass as she gazed out at the transformed world. It was beautiful, yes, but also fragile, the frost's perfection a reminder of the fleeting nature of such moments. She felt a familiar ache in her chest, a mix of awe and melancholy, a recognition of beauty that carried with it the knowledge of its impermanence. The kettle whistled in the kitchen, pulling her from her reverie. Isabelle moved through the house with measured steps, her fingers brushing against the furniture as though seeking reassurance in their solidity. The tea warmed her hands as she cradled the cup, its steam curling upward in soft tendrils. She dressed quickly, layering sweaters and scarves against the cold. The frost had whispered an invitation, and Isabelle was determined to accept. Pulling on her boots, she stepped into the garden, the air biting at her cheeks and filling her lungs with its crisp clarity. Her first step onto the frost-covered grass was tentative, her boot crunching faintly against the frozen ground. The sound seemed almost intrusive, breaking the profound stillness of the morning. But as she moved further into the garden, the frost's beauty enveloped her, its shimmering intricacy drawing her deeper into its spell. The snowdrops by the bench were no longer soft and delicate. Their petals had become icy sculptures, their fragility heightened by the frost's embrace. Isabelle knelt beside them, her gloved fingers brushing lightly against their frozen edges. They were both vulnerable and enduring, their quiet strength a testament to the cycles of nature. She moved on, her steps taking her to the oak tree at the garden's center. Its branches, stark against the pale sky, were outlined in frost, their texture enhanced by the icy coating. Isabelle looked up, her breath forming clouds as she admired the way the sunlight danced along the tree's edges, turning them into lines of fire and ice. Beyond the tree, the creek beckoned, its muted song blending with the faint rustle of the wind. The path to its edge was slippery, the frost turning each step into a careful negotiation. When Isabelle reached the creek, she paused, her gaze drawn to the way the ice had transformed its surface. Small patches of open water reflected the sky, their darkness a striking contrast to the frost's brightness. A fallen branch lay partly submerged in the creek, its bark coated in frost that sparkled like jewels. Isabelle crouched to examine it, her reflection mingling with the branch's image in the water. The creek's flow was slow, its movements almost imperceptible beneath the thin layer of ice. It reminded her of herself, a quiet persistence, a steady continuation despite the weight of the cold. The meadow beyond the creek was untouched, its grasses bent under the frost's weight. Isabelle crossed the wooden bridge, her boots leaving faint imprints on its frost-covered planks. The meadow stretched wide before her, its stillness profound. She wandered aimlessly, her hands tucked into her pockets, her heart attuned to the frost's quiet song. At the meadow's center, the willow tree stood in silent splendor. Its long branches were weighed down by the frost, their tips brushing the ground like the strands of an icy veil. Isabelle approached it slowly, her boots crunching softly against the frozen earth. Beneath the tree, the swing swayed faintly in the breeze, its ropes stiff with frost. Isabelle stood beneath the willow's branches, her breath catching as she took in the scene. The swing, the tree, the frost. It was a tableau of stillness and transformation, a moment captured in the delicate balance between change and stasis. She reached out, her hand brushing against the swing's seat. The wood was cold beneath her fingers, its surface slick with ice. She didn't sit this time. Instead, she stood there, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the meadow met the sky. The sun was climbing higher now, its warmth slowly breaking through the frost's grip. Droplets of water began to form along the edges of the tree's branches, catching the light as they fell, one by one, to the ground below. The frost was melting, its beauty fading with the sun's advance. Isabelle felt a pang of sadness, but also a quiet gratitude. The frost's brief reign had been a gift, a reminder of the fleeting nature of beauty and the importance of witnessing it while it lasted. As she made her way back to the house, the garden was changing once more. The paths she had walked were wet now, their frost-softened edges glinting faintly in the sunlight. The snowdrops by the bench were beginning to thaw, their petals drooping slightly as they shed their icy shells. Inside, Isabelle shed her layers and settled by the fire, her tea warming her hands once more. She gazed out at the garden, her heart full of the morning's quiet revelations. The frost had come and gone, leaving its mark not just on the garden, but on her as well. And as the fire crackled softly and the day unfolded, Isabelle felt a quiet sense of contentment. The frost had spoken in its own language, and she had listened, finding in its delicate beauty a reflection of her own journey. A reminder that even the coldest moments could hold warmth and wonder if one chose to see it. Chapter 7. The Melody Beneath the Rain. The first snow of the season arrived quietly, falling in the early hours before dawn. When Isabelle awoke, the world was cloaked in a soft, undisturbed white, the kind that muffled sound and created a silence so profound it felt almost sacred. She sat up in bed, the faint light of morning filtering through the curtains, and for a moment, she simply listened. The snow had transformed the familiar landscape. The garden, so often defined by the vivid colors of flowers and the deep greens of leaves, was now a monochrome masterpiece, its contours softened by the snow's gentle embrace. The oak tree, the bench, the winding paths, all had been rendered anew, their shapes emerging from the white like ghosts of themselves. Isabelle dressed warmly, layering sweaters and pulling thick woolen socks over her feet before sliding into her boots. She wrapped a scarf around her neck and donned her gloves, the chill of the house spurring her into motion. A simple breakfast of tea and toast followed, but her thoughts were already outside, drawn to the stillness waiting beyond the window. The snow crunched faintly beneath her boots as she stepped into the garden. The sound was crisp and satisfying, a small reminder of her presence in the otherwise untouched expanse. Each step left an imprint, the perfect symmetry of the snow disrupted by her passage. Isabelle moved slowly, her eyes tracing the shapes and textures the snow had created. The snowdrops by the bench were almost entirely hidden now, their delicate stems bowed under the weight of the snow. Isabelle crouched to brush some of the snow away, her gloved fingers careful as they worked. Beneath the white blanket, the flowers remained intact, their resilience a quiet reassurance against the starkness of the season. She moved on, her steps leading her to the oak tree at the garden's center. Its branches were heavy with snow, their dark bark stark against the pale sky. Isabelle stood beneath its canopy, looking up at the intricate patterns the snow had created. The branches formed a delicate lattice, each intersection a tiny marvel of nature's artistry. The creek was her next destination, its familiar path now hidden beneath the snow. Isabelle navigated it by memory, her steps careful as she approached the wooden bridge. The creek's surface was mostly frozen, its once vivid movements stilled by the cold. Yet beneath the ice, she could see the faintest hint of water flowing, a reminder of life persisting even in stillness. On the other side of the creek, the meadow stretched wide and white, its grasses completely obscured. The willow tree stood at its center, its long branches transformed into arcs of snow and ice. The swing hung motionless, its ropes stiff and unyielding. Isabelle approached the tree, her breath forming soft clouds in the frosty air. She stood beneath the willow, her gaze sweeping across the meadow. The snow had erased the boundaries of the landscape, blending earth and sky into a seamless expanse of white. It felt as though the world had been reduced to its essence, each detail simplified yet profound. As she stood there, the wind stirred faintly, sending a flurry of snow from the tree's branches. The flakes caught the sunlight as they fell, sparkling like tiny stars before settling on the ground. Isabelle closed her eyes, letting the cold air wash over her face, her heart swelling with a quiet sense of wonder. The snow had a way of drawing her into herself, its silence creating a space for reflection. Memories rose unbidden, images of winters past layered over the present like translucent veils. She remembered building snowmen in this very meadow, her hands red and raw from the cold. She remembered the laughter that had filled the air, the way it had echoed against the snow-covered hills. But those days felt distant now, their echoes faint and fleeting. Isabelle opened her eyes, her gaze returning to the present. The snow was not the same, and neither was she. Yet there was beauty in that change, a reminder that life moved forward even as it carried the weight of the past. She turned back toward the garden, her footsteps trailing behind her in a line of quiet disruption. The house, with its warm glow and faint curl of smoke rising from the chimney, stood as a beacon against the white expanse. Isabelle made her way to the shed, retrieving a broom to clear the snow from the garden paths. The work was steady and meditative, each sweep of the broom revealing the stone beneath the snow. Isabelle focused on the task, her breath creating small puffs in the air as she moved. The snow fell from the broom in soft arcs, landing with a faint whisper against the ground. By the time she finished, the sun was higher in the sky, its light catching on the snow and creating a dazzling display of color. The garden paths were clear, their winding lines creating a contrast against the white. Isabelle leaned on the broom for a moment, her gaze sweeping over the transformed landscape. The stillness of the snow lingered in the air, its presence a reminder of the quiet beauty that could be found in even the coldest moments. Isabelle returned the broom to the shed and made her way back to the house, her body weary but her heart full. Inside, the warmth of the fire welcomed her, its crackling a comforting counterpoint to the silence outside. Isabelle settled by the window, her tea in hand, and watched as the sun began its slow descent. The snow, with its echoes and its stillness, remained a constant presence, a quiet reminder of the beauty that could be found in the simplest of things. And as the day gave way to evening, Isabelle felt a deep sense of peace. The snow would not last forever, but its memory would linger, etched into her heart like the echoes of winters past. Chapter 8. In the Breath of Wandering Stars. The afternoon was heavy with the promise of snow, the air thick and still, as though the earth itself were holding its breath. Isabelle stepped out into the garden, her coat pulled tightly around her and her boots crunching faintly against the frost-laden ground. Overhead, the sky was a tapestry of muted grays, each layer blending seamlessly into the next. The garden felt different today, not silent, but subdued, as though it, too, was waiting. The oak tree stood tall and solemn at its center, its branches bare and reaching skyward, stark against the pale heavens. Around its base, the snowdrops continued their quiet vigil, their heads bowed in silent reverence. Isabelle walked slowly, her footsteps measured and deliberate. The air carried a faint metallic tang, the kind that always preceded a storm. She paused by the bench, her gloved hands resting lightly on its back as she gazed out over the garden. The paths she had cleared were now faintly dusted with frost, their lines blurred by the shifting of the wind. Beyond the garden, the creek murmured softly, its surface dark and glinting beneath the gathering clouds. Isabelle's eyes followed its winding course, her thoughts drifting like the water beneath the ice. There was a comfort in its constancy, its endless flow a reminder that life persisted, even in the coldest of seasons. The willow tree in the meadow drew her gaze, its long, silvered branches swaying gently in the breeze. Isabelle found herself drawn to it, her feet carrying her across the garden and over the bridge that spanned the creek. The wood creaked faintly beneath her weight, the sound almost swallowed by the stillness around her. The meadow was quiet, its grasses bowed beneath the frost. Isabelle's boots left faint imprints in the frozen ground as she made her way to the willow. Beneath its canopy, the air was different, softer, quieter, as though the tree itself was a guardian of secrets. The swing hung motionless, its ropes stiff with frost, and Isabelle reached out to touch it, her fingers brushing against the cold, slick surface of the wood. She didn't sit this time. Instead, she stood there, her gaze drifting upward to the branches overhead. The frost that coated them caught the faint light filtering through the clouds, turning them into threads of silver that seemed to glow softly in the dusk. It was a sight that filled her with a quiet awe, a reminder of the beauty that could be found in even the simplest of things. The first snowflake fell as Isabelle stood beneath the tree. It landed on her glove, a tiny, intricate star that melted almost immediately. Then another and another, until the air was filled with a soft flurry of white. The snow fell gently, its descent almost imperceptible, and Isabelle tilted her head back, her breath forming small clouds as she watched it fall. The world around her was transformed once more, the snow softening the edges of the landscape and muffling the faint sounds of the creek and the wind. Isabelle felt a sense of stillness settle over her, a quiet acceptance of the moment and all it carried. As the snow continued to fall, she made her way back to the garden, her footsteps trailing behind her in a line of quiet disruption. The oak tree greeted her as she returned, its branches now dusted with a fine layer of snow. Isabelle paused beneath it, her gaze tracing the intricate patterns the snow had created against the bark. The garden paths were quickly disappearing beneath the snow, their lines fading into the white expanse. Isabelle retrieved the broom from the shed, her movements steady as she began to clear them once more. The work was soothing, each sweep of the broom revealing the stone beneath the snow and leaving a faint trail of warmth in its wake. By the time she finished, the garden was cloaked in twilight, the light fading to a soft, silvery glow. The snow continued to fall, its flakes catching the faint light and turning it into a shimmering dance. Isabelle stood in the center of the garden, her breath rising in soft clouds as she took it all in. The house beckoned, its warm glow a contrast to the cold beauty of the garden. Isabelle made her way inside, her body weary but her heart full. She shed her coat and boots by the door, the warmth of the fire wrapping around her as she entered the living room. Settling into her favorite chair by the window, Isabelle cradled a mug of tea in her hands, the steam curling upward in delicate tendrils. The snow outside continued to fall, its quiet persistence a balm to her spirit. She watched as the garden disappeared beneath its white blanket, the world outside fading into a soft, undisturbed stillness. The evening unfolded slowly, the fire crackling softly in the hearth as Isabelle sat in quiet contemplation. The threads of silver in the dusk had woven themselves into her heart, their beauty a reminder of the moments that made life rich and full. And as the night deepened and the snow continued to fall, Isabelle felt a quiet peace settle over her, a contentment that lingered long after the last light of day had faded. Chapter 9. Lanterns guiding the forgotten shore. The storm had come suddenly, sweeping in from the north with a force that shook the earth itself. Isabelle had barely noticed the first signs, a subtle shift in the wind, a change in the texture of the air, until the sky darkened and the first raindrops began to fall. The rhythm of the rain was like 1,000 tiny hammers against the roof, its sound growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment. At first, Isabelle had retreated inside, seeking shelter from the sudden downpour. The house, warm and dry, offered a refuge, but she could not shake the pull of the storm outside. The wind howled through the trees, bending their branches low and sending sheets of rain slashing against the windows. The fire crackled in the hearth, but even its warmth could not quiet the restlessness that stirred within her. She had wandered from room to room, her fingers brushing against the furniture, as if seeking something she couldn't name. The storm outside had unsettled her, but in its chaos, there was a strange kind of beauty, a reminder of nature's raw power and its ability to transform even the most familiar landscapes into something unrecognizable. Eventually, she found herself standing by the window, gazing out at the garden. The rain fell in thick, heavy sheets, creating rivers that ran down the stone paths, blurring the edges of the world. The oak tree in the center of the garden was barely visible through the storm's haze, its once proud branches now swaying violently in the wind. The garden that had been so serene, so still, was now a tangle of motion and sound. The swing that had hung so quietly in the willow tree was now tossed about by the wind, its ropes creaking as it swung back and forth. The creek, too, was alive with the storm's energy, its waters churning as the rain fed its flow, transforming the once calm current into a raging torrent. Isabelle could not look away, mesmerized by the fury of nature, by the way the world had been completely transformed in a matter of moments. The snowdrops she had tended to so carefully were hidden beneath the downpour, their delicate petals swallowed by the relentless rain. The garden paths were disappearing beneath rushing streams, the frost that had clung to the earth now washed away by the storm's power. She felt a sense of awe as she watched the world change before her eyes, the storm's violence both terrifying and beautiful. There was something within her that resonated with the chaos outside, a part of her that longed to be swept up in it, to be carried away by the storm's fury. But another part of her, the part that had learned to find peace in the small, still moments, resisted. She stepped back from the window, her heart pounding in her chest, and moved to the center of the room. The fire, though it crackled and flickered in the hearth, seemed small and insignificant compared to the storm outside. It offered warmth, but it could not offer the same kind of wild energy, the same kind of raw freedom that the storm had. Isabelle sat down in her favorite chair, her fingers tracing the worn fabric of the armrest as her mind wandered. The storm was an outward expression of a storm she had long carried within her, a restless longing, a sense of being on the edge of something just out of reach. She had always felt it, this tension between the stillness she craved and the chaos she feared but was drawn to. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as though seeking to break through. Isabelle closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her, a soft murmur in the background of her thoughts. She could feel the storm's energy in her bones, like a pulse that matched the beating of her heart. It was as though everything was alive and in motion, always shifting, always changing. But even in the midst of the storm, there was a stillness within her. It was not the same kind of quiet she had once found in the garden, in the soft fall of snow or the gentle rustling of leaves, but a deeper kind, one that could not be disturbed by the forces of nature or the passage of time. She had learned, over the years, to live with the storm inside her, to find peace within the chaos. The hours passed slowly, the storm's intensity ebbing and flowing in waves, as if the earth itself were taking deep breaths. Isabelle watched the rain fall harder and harder, her thoughts meandering between memories of the past and the uncertainty of the future. When she finally moved, it was as though the world had shifted back into focus. The storm was still raging outside, but it no longer seemed as overwhelming. She had come to understand something in those quiet moments of reflection, that the storm, both the one outside and the one within, was part of her. It was not something to fear or fight, but something to embrace. Isabelle stood and moved to the door, her feet sure on the stone floor as she stepped into the storm. The wind hit her immediately, a biting force that pushed against her body and whipped her hair around her face. The rain pelted her skin, cold and sharp, but she stood there, unyielding. She let the storm touch her, let it rush through her and around her, feeling its power and its pull. The garden had changed, but so had she. The chaos of the storm no longer felt like an adversary, but a part of the world's natural rhythm. She could feel the earth beneath her feet, steady and unwavering, and she could feel the pulse of the storm in the air, quickening and shifting with every gust of wind. The willow tree swayed in the wind, its branches bending low, and the creek beside her was a torrent of wild, rushing water. The swing still swayed in the wind, its ropes now whipping wildly, but there was a beauty in its motion, a sense of freedom in the way it was carried by the storm. Isabelle stood beneath the willow, the rain drenching her, but she felt no cold. The storm, in its wild, chaotic beauty, had unlocked something inside her, a sense of connection, of oneness with the world around her. And for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace, not despite the storm, but because of it. The world was not a place of calm, of stillness, but a place of constant motion, of constant change. And that was what made it beautiful. The storm would pass, as all storms do, but its memory, its power, would linger in her heart, a reminder of the quiet strength that came with embracing the wildness of life. Chapter 10. The Garden That Time Forgot. The morning after the storm, everything was different. The air felt fresh, as though the world had been washed clean. Isabelle stepped outside, the ground beneath her boots still wet from the rain, but the sky above was clear, a pale blue that stretched endlessly in every direction. The trees, the garden, the creek, everything seemed to stand still, as though waiting for something. The storm had passed, but the traces of its power were still present, woven into the fabric of the world. The garden had transformed once again. The paths, still glistening with moisture, now shimmered in the early light, the stones gleaming with the remnants of the storm. The oak tree stood at the center, its branches bending under the weight of the rain, but its roots were grounded, strong, and unyielding. Around it, the earth had soaked up the water, its surface damp but fertile, waiting for new life to take hold. Isabelle moved slowly, her feet silent on the damp earth as she walked the familiar paths. The willow tree in the meadow was no longer a dark silhouette against the sky, but a soft figure bathed in sunlight. The branches, still heavy with moisture, caught the light and sent glimmers of gold dancing through the air. Isabelle stood beneath the tree for a moment, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. The storm's chill now gone, replaced by a quiet warmth that seemed to fill the world around her. She glanced down at the ground, where delicate new shoots had begun to emerge from the soil. The garden, though battered by the storm, was already beginning to heal. The snowdrops, once hidden by the rain, had risen once more, their pale faces turned toward the sky. Their petals were fragile, but they had survived, their resilience a testament to the quiet strength that lay beneath the surface of the world. Isabelle bent down, her fingers brushing the delicate leaves, marveling at the way the earth had reclaimed itself in the wake of the storm. It was as though the world had a rhythm, a pulse that beat in time with the seasons, the storms, and the cycles of life. Everything had its place, its moment, and now, the garden was in a new phase, quiet, but full of possibility. She rose slowly and walked toward the creek, her feet sinking slightly into the soft earth. The water was still high from the storm, rushing faster than usual, its current wild and untamed. The rocks that had once been visible beneath the surface were now hidden, swallowed by the water's force. Isabelle stood at the edge, watching the way the water moved, strong, determined, never slowing, never stopping. It was a force of nature, as unyielding as the storm itself, but there was a beauty in it, a purpose that only came with time. The wind had calmed, and the stillness of the morning was almost too perfect to be real. Isabelle could hear the soft rustling of leaves, the distant hum of the world waking up. The birds, now singing again after the storm, filled the air with their song, a melody that was light and sweet, but also full of depth. It was a reminder that life, no matter how tumultuous, always returned to harmony. As Isabelle walked back toward the house, her eyes lifted to the sky once more. The clouds had all but disappeared, leaving behind a vast expanse of blue. The light from the sun filtered through the branches of the oak tree, casting long shadows on the ground. It was as though the entire world had been reset, each element falling into its place, each moment unfolding as it should. She returned to the house, her coat now open to the warm air, her cheeks flushed from the crisp morning. Inside, the fire in the hearth was a small flicker of warmth against the lingering coolness of the night. Isabelle sat by the window, watching as the light grew stronger, spreading over the landscape like a gentle caress. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered in the way the world had changed, in the way everything seemed to be holding its breath. She felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, as though the storm had been a necessary part of the cycle, a moment of chaos that would give way to something new. The world was different now, but it was still the same rhythms of life, the same quiet beauty in the small moments. The storm had not broken the earth. It had revealed it, uncovered the layers that were hidden beneath. Outside, the garden was coming back to life. The flowers, the trees, the birds, all had found their place again. And Isabelle, too, felt as though she had found her place within it, her heart in sync with the world's rhythm. There was still so much to learn, so much to experience, but she no longer felt as though she were chasing after something just beyond her reach. For the first time in a long while, Isabelle felt a sense of completeness. It was as though everything she had been searching for, answers, peace, understanding, had been there all along, waiting for her to see it. The storm had come and gone, but the light between the leaves, the quiet promise of the world, remained. It was there, in the calm after the storm, in the stillness that followed chaos. Isabelle stood and moved to the door, her gaze lingering on the garden outside. The light was fading as evening approached, casting the world in a golden glow. The willow tree in the distance swayed gently in the breeze, its branches swishing softly. Isabelle smiled to herself, the warmth in her heart as steady and unshakable as the oak tree standing firm in the center of the garden. The storm had passed. The world was at peace. And in the quiet of the evening, Isabelle knew that she, too, had found her place in it all. Chapter 11. Echoes of a Fading Horizon. The days that followed the storm were marked by a stillness that seemed to stretch on without end. It wasn't the quiet of a world at rest, but rather the quiet that comes after something immense, when the echo of the event still lingers in the air, as though the world itself is holding its breath. Isabelle felt it in the way the air seemed thicker, in the way the light lingered a little longer each day, as though the earth were savoring the moment before it was ready to begin again. She spent most of her time in the garden, walking its winding paths and observing the small, delicate changes that had taken root after the storm. The earth had healed quickly, as though it had been waiting for a reason to show its strength. The flowers that had bent under the weight of the rain were now standing tall, their colors brighter than before, as though they had been reborn. The trees, their branches still heavy with the last remnants of moisture, swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves catching the light like precious jewels. The creek had settled too, its waters no longer a raging torrent, but a steady, calm flow, carrying with it the echoes of the storm that had passed. The rocks, once hidden beneath the water's surface, were now visible again, their smooth surfaces glistening in the soft light of the afternoon. Isabelle moved through the garden slowly, taking in the small changes, each one a reflection of the larger rhythm of life. The storm had shaken the world, but now everything had returned to its place. The chaos had given way to peace, and in that peace, Isabelle found a strange kind of beauty. There was something sacred in the quiet, in the stillness that followed the storm. It was as if the earth had been reset, its natural rhythms realigned after a moment of upheaval. Yet, despite the outward calm, Isabelle couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting inside her, too. She had spent so long seeking something: peace, understanding, a sense of belonging, and for the first time, she felt that she was standing on the edge of something greater. There was a quiet longing in her heart, a pull toward something just beyond her reach, something that had always been there, just waiting for her to recognize it. She sat beneath the oak tree in the center of the garden, the cool earth pressing against her back as she gazed up at the sky. The clouds were gathering once again, though this time they seemed soft, a quiet presence rather than a looming force. The wind, which had been so fierce during the storm, had calmed to a gentle whisper, and the world around her seemed to hum with an almost imperceptible energy. It was a quiet, unseen force, one that could only be felt when everything else had quieted enough to allow its presence to be known. Isabelle closed her eyes, letting the peace of the moment wash over her, but the silence within her heart seemed to grow louder. It wasn't the same kind of silence she had found in the stillness of the storm, where the world had seemed to pause, but a deeper kind of silence. A silence filled with unspoken questions and unmet needs. It was the kind of silence that speaks to the spaces between things, to the places where words fail and everything is left unsaid. She had learned, over the years, to live with silence. She had come to understand that silence wasn't always the absence of sound, but the presence of something more, something larger than words could contain. But this silence, this weight of it, felt different. It wasn't the peaceful silence of contemplation or the quiet comfort of solitude. It was a silence that demanded attention, a silence that refused to be ignored. Isabelle stood and moved slowly toward the house, her thoughts swirling around her like the breeze that stirred the leaves above. The air had shifted again, the temperature cooling as the sun began to dip lower in the sky. She felt the weight of the days passing, the way time moved so quickly, so silently. Each moment seemed to slip away unnoticed, leaving only the quiet behind. Inside the house, The fire in the hearth had long since died down, its warmth now a faint memory. Isabelle moved to the window, her fingers brushing the glass as she gazed out at the garden. The world outside was changing, the light of the day fading into the cool shadows of evening. The garden had always been a place of solace for her, a place where she could feel grounded, where she could lose herself in the simple beauty of nature. But tonight, even the garden felt distant, as though it were a memory fading into the past. She turned away from the window, her heart heavy with a sense of something unspoken, something that lingered at the edges of her thoughts. There was a restlessness within her, a quiet ache that had grown in the silence, a longing for something she could not name. She had spent so long searching for peace, for answers, but now, in this quiet space, she realized that the answers were not what she had expected. The silence around her was no longer a comfort. It was a weight. It pressed down on her chest, making it harder to breathe, harder to see the world clearly. There was no name for the longing that stirred in her heart, no explanation for the way the air seemed to shift around her, as though it, too, was waiting for something to change. Outside, the night had settled in, the stars beginning to appear one by one in the sky above. Isabelle stepped into the garden once more, the coolness of the evening air wrapping around her like a cloak. She walked through the now familiar paths, her steps light on the soft earth. The willow tree stood in the distance, its branches swaying gently, and the creek continued its quiet song, the sound of water moving over stone a steady, reassuring presence. But the garden, with all its beauty and tranquility, could no longer fill the space inside her. She had come to realize that there was something more, something beyond the peace she had sought for so long. The silence, which had once been her refuge, had become a mirror, reflecting back to her the depth of her own longing. It wasn't the world that was silent. It was her own heart, closed off from the things she feared most. Isabelle stood still, her gaze resting on the moonlight that danced over the surface of the creek. The world was beautiful, yes, but there was something deeper that called to her, something beyond the beauty of the earth. She had spent so long in silence, waiting for something to break through, but now she understood. It wasn't the world that needed to change. It was her. And so, with the weight of silence heavy in her chest, Isabelle took a step forward into the night, knowing that the quiet would no longer hold her. She was ready to listen, not just to the world around her, but to the silence within, the silence that had carried her so far, and now, in the stillness, was asking her to finally hear what it had been waiting to say. Chapter 12. Threads woven by midnight. The days bled together, indistinct and yet heavy with meaning. Time itself seemed to slow, stretching the hours into long silences that left Isabelle caught between moments. She had come to embrace the quiet, but now, it felt as though it was shifting in subtle ways, pressing in on her from every direction, like the stillness of a storm before it broke. Each new morning brought a strange calm, a feeling of both expectation and resignation that hung in the air like a soft, unspoken promise. The garden had, once again, become her refuge, but even here, beneath the ancient oak and the stretching branches of the willow, Isabelle felt a restless stirring within her. The garden, with its quiet beauty, was no longer enough to fill the void that had quietly settled in her chest. She had spent so long looking outward, seeking the peace of the earth, the rhythm of the seasons, but now she understood. The quiet she sought was not to be found in the soil or the sky, but in herself. The earth was changing, but so was she. The flowers, the trees, the birds, they all moved through their cycles with an ease Isabelle envied. They grew, they bloomed, they rested, and they died, each stage as inevitable as the next. She had been a part of that rhythm once, but now, something had shifted within her. She had grown, too, but her growth felt different, as though it had been pushed into new directions by forces she couldn't name. The garden still held a kind of magic for her, but it no longer held all the answers. Each evening, as the sun sank behind the horizon, Isabelle would stand at the edge of the creek, watching the way the water shimmered in the fading light, the reflections of the trees and the sky rippling across its surface. The quiet of the moment was profound, but it no longer gave her the peace it once had. Now, it felt like the pause between two heartbeats, suspended in time, just waiting for the next movement to come. But what movement would that be? She didn't know. The willow tree, with its branches swaying softly in the wind, seemed to be the only thing unaffected by the weight of time. Its leaves fluttered gently, whispering secrets that Isabelle could not hear. The tree had been there for longer than she could imagine, standing still through the seasons, watching as the world around it changed, yet never faltering. The thought of it brought her a small comfort, but also a bittersweet ache. The tree stood so firmly rooted in the earth, and Isabelle, too, felt herself rooted to the garden, to this place. But she knew, deep down, that she couldn't remain here forever. Not in this state of waiting, this state of half-living. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a silver light over the garden, and Isabelle, as she had done many times before, walked its paths in silence. The soft rustling of the leaves was the only sound that accompanied her, a gentle reminder that the world was still alive, still moving. It had been days, perhaps weeks, since she had felt truly connected to anything or anyone. The stillness of the world around her mirrored the stillness within her, a silence so deep it almost seemed suffocating. Her thoughts began to shift in unexpected ways. She had always found solace in the certainty of nature, in the predictable cycles of the seasons, but now the steady rhythm of the earth seemed to mock her uncertainty. She had tried to find answers in the quiet, but the more she sought them, the more they slipped through her fingers, like the falling leaves that danced on the breeze. And still, she waited for something to change, waited for a sign. But there was no sign, no moment of clarity that would open up the world to her in a new light. It was just this long, lingering breath between heartbeats, this silence that pressed against her chest. There was no way forward except through it. The waiting had become a kind of burden, a weight she could no longer ignore. The beauty of the garden, the stillness of the earth, it had all become too much, too constant, too unchanging. It had been a place of peace for her, but now it had become a mirror to the stasis she felt within herself. The world was quiet, but it was not still. The creek still ran, the wind still whispered, the trees still swayed. The garden was still in motion, even if it was imperceptible to the human eye. And Isabelle, too, was still in motion, though she could not yet see where her path would lead. The uncertainty of it made her feel small, lost in the vastness of time and space. But as the days passed, as the evenings turned into nights, and the nights turned back into mornings, something began to shift inside her. She could feel it, as subtle as the breeze that ruffled the leaves, as persistent as the changing of the seasons. There was a quiet stirring in her heart, a sense that she was on the verge of something. But what? She couldn't say. But for the first time in what felt like forever, the silence was no longer oppressive. It was simply there. She had learned to exist within it, to move with it, as the world around her did. The next morning, Isabelle woke to the soft sound of birdsong, a sound that seemed almost new after the long silence of the past days. The light outside was gentle, spilling into the room through the open window. It was a stillness that felt more alive than before, and Isabelle knew in that moment that she had changed. The world had not shifted, but her perspective had. She could feel it in the way she moved through the space around her, in the way the sunlight seemed to catch the dust in the air, making everything seem brighter, more present. She stepped outside into the garden once more, her breath coming easier than it had in days. The morning light touched everything gently, and as she walked beneath the oak tree, she finally understood. It wasn't the world that needed to change. It was her. She had been waiting for something to break through, but what she needed most was already within her. The quiet strength, the patient endurance of time itself. The silence was no longer a wait. It was a breath, a pause, a moment of quiet between heartbeats. And for the first time in a long while, Isabelle allowed herself to simply be, to stand still, to wait, not for a change to come, but for the quiet to settle around her. She no longer sought answers. She simply let the silence be enough. Chapter 13. A promise stitched into the wind. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, soft and golden, spilling across the land with a quiet assurance. Isabelle stood at the edge of the garden, her feet bare against the cool grass, her heart still and yet alive with a restless energy she could not fully explain. The morning air was crisp, filled with the scent of earth and dew, and the quiet hum of the world coming to life around her. It was a sound she had come to cherish, the pulse of the earth, the gentle stir of the world waking from its slumber. The garden, too, had begun to stir with the promise of a new day. The flowers, which had bloomed so brightly in the months before, now stood with their heads bowed, as if in quiet reverence to the sun's first light. The trees, their branches heavy with the weight of the seasons, whispered to one another in the wind, the soft rustling a conversation of sorts, though no words were exchanged. It was the language of the earth, a language Isabelle had long since learned to understand. She watched the light slowly fill the garden, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground like the fingers of a dream. The once quiet creek now sang its familiar song, the gentle burble of water moving over stone, and Isabelle, for the first time in weeks, felt a sense of movement within herself. The stillness that had enveloped her for so long, that had pressed down on her chest like a weight, was now being replaced by something else. Something more fluid, more alive. For the first time, she felt the space within her begin to expand. The silence, which had once seemed so heavy, now felt like the calm before something profound. Something new was coming, and she could feel it in the air around her. In the way the world itself seemed to hold its breath. The horizon, with its soft, glowing promise, seemed to beckon her forward, though she did not know where it would lead. She did not need to know. All she needed was to take the next step. Isabelle closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face, the soft breeze that lifted her hair and tangled it around her fingers. The cool earth beneath her feet grounded her, reminding her that she was part of this world, as much a part of the rhythm of nature as the trees, the flowers, the sky. She had always felt connected to this place, but now, more than ever, she felt the deep, unspoken bond that tied her to the world, to everything around her. The garden, the earth, the seasons, they were all part of her, and she was a part of them. But there was more to it now. There was a movement within her, a sense of change that was not just the natural course of things but something deeper, something she could not yet understand. It was as though the world had shifted, and in that shift, she had been carried along with it. The silence, the waiting, had all been part of it, necessary steps in the journey that was unfolding before her. The days had passed slowly, but in each one, Isabelle had felt herself moving forward, bit by bit, without even realizing it. It was as though she had been walking in a fog, her path unclear, but now, with the dawn of this new day, the fog was beginning to lift. The horizon no longer seemed like an unreachable place, but a promise, a destination she had been unknowingly moving toward. Her steps, though slow, were no longer hesitant. They were filled with a quiet determination. an unspoken understanding that the world was waiting for her to take them. She walked through the garden with a newfound grace, her feet light against the earth, the world around her full of life and color. The breeze whispered through the trees, and Isabelle felt the pulse of the earth beneath her. It was a rhythm that had always been there, but now she was finally in tune with it, moving in harmony with it. As she passed the oak tree, its branches now reaching higher, its leaves more vibrant than ever, Isabelle paused for a moment, her hand resting on the rough bark. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, taking in the scent of the earth, the warmth of the sun, the sound of the birds calling to one another in the distance. She felt at peace, not because everything was perfect, but because she was no longer fighting against the current of her own life. She had finally surrendered to it, letting it carry her where it would. There was a subtle shift in the air, a shift that went unnoticed by the world around her, but not by Isabelle. It was as if the very fabric of the universe had changed, the threads of her life weaving together in ways she could not yet understand. The uncertainty that had once clouded her thoughts was now gone, replaced by a quiet certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be at this moment in time. She made her way to the creek, its waters flowing gently over the rocks, the sound soft and soothing. Isabelle knelt beside it, her fingers brushing the surface of the water, the coolness of it sending a shiver through her skin. The water was clear, the sunlight dancing on its surface, casting ripples of light that seemed to shimmer with possibility. For a moment, Isabelle stared into the water, watching the way the world above it mirrored its movements. The creek, the trees, the sky. Everything was reflected in the water, yet everything was still separate, still its own entity. It reminded her of the way she felt now, a part of the world, yet separate from it, caught between two states of being, two versions of herself. She had always known she was connected to something larger, but now, she realized, she was not merely part of the world. She was part of a larger journey, one that had begun long before she had ever understood it, and one that would continue long after she had let go of her questions. The sun rose higher in the sky, casting its golden light across the garden, and Isabelle stood, taking one last glance at the creek before turning back toward the house. Her steps were no longer slow or uncertain. They were purposeful, filled with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing one's own heart. There was no need to search for answers anymore. The horizon was before her, the promise of the future as bright and open as the sky. She walked toward the house, her heart light and her thoughts quiet. The weight of the past had lifted, and the future, uncertain though it was, seemed full of promise. Isabelle no longer sought to control it, to shape it into something she could understand. She would follow where it led, knowing that whatever came next was simply the next step in a journey that was already unfolding, one breath at a time. And as the sun climbed higher, bathing the world in its light, Isabelle finally understood. The promise of the horizon was not in the destination, but in the journey itself, in the quiet moments between heartbeats, in the spaces between the stars. The world would continue to turn, the days would continue to pass, and Isabelle, at last, was ready to meet it all with open arms, knowing that in each step, in each moment, she was exactly where she was meant to be. Chapter 14. Forever at the Edge of Tomorrow. The evening arrived softly, like a sigh after a long day. Isabelle stood at the edge of the garden, looking out across the horizon as the sky bled into shades of violet and amber. The world around her had shifted in ways she had never anticipated, and yet now, as the sun dipped below the earth, casting its final glow over the land, she felt a deep, undeniable sense of peace. The garden was quiet, save for the whisper of the wind through the trees, the rustle of the leaves, and the faint hum of the distant world continuing its endless motion. The creaking of the oak's branches, the steady flow of the creek, the chirping of the crickets, all of it seemed to be a reminder that, Though her life had moved through seasons of change and uncertainty, the earth itself remained constant. The rhythm of nature was never disturbed, never forced to bend to human whims, and yet it moved with such grace that it seemed to offer itself willingly. Isabelle could feel the weight of the past weeks, months even, lifting from her shoulders. She had walked through so many stages of herself, shed so many skins, all in search of something that felt real, something that anchored her to the world in a way that made sense. She had sought peace, and in the end, peace had found her, not in the form of answers or destinations, but in the quiet acceptance of the unknown. As the twilight deepened, she moved slowly through the garden, her footsteps barely making a sound on the path. The air was cooler now, the sun no longer warm against her skin, but the light from the moon offered a soft, silvery glow, casting long shadows that danced across the ground. The garden seemed to take on a new form at night, its familiar flowers and trees transformed into silhouettes against the darkening sky. It was both the same and different, and Isabelle understood now that this was how life had always been. An ongoing dance between the known and the unknown, the familiar and the foreign, the light and the dark. The stillness was comforting, like a blanket that wrapped itself around her, warm and soft, keeping out the uncertainties that had once filled her mind. The world around her seemed to breathe with her, its pulse steady and calming, like the rhythm of her own heartbeat. Isabelle no longer felt out of place. She no longer felt disconnected from the garden, from the earth, or from the passage of time. She was a part of it all, as much as the trees, the flowers, the sky. As she reached the edge of the garden, near the willow tree, she paused, her gaze drawn to the horizon once again. The sun had disappeared completely now, and the world had settled into its quiet nocturnal rhythm. The sky, darkening to deep indigo, held no answers, only the vast, silent promise of the unknown. But Isabelle no longer feared it. In the absence of certainty, she had found a kind of freedom, a freedom that allowed her to let go of the need to control everything, to understand everything. The storm that had raged in her heart, the tumultuous questions and doubts, had finally passed, leaving behind a calmness she had not thought possible. The willow tree stood before her, its long branches swaying in the gentle evening breeze. There was something sacred about it now, something that spoke to her on a level deeper than understanding. The tree had stood here for centuries, its roots tangled deep in the earth, its branches stretching high toward the sky. It was a symbol of endurance, of quiet strength, of life in all its forms. And Isabelle, as she stood before it, felt herself to be part of that cycle, a part of the rhythm that moved through the world, through the ages, through the seasons. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the breeze wash over her, the cool night air filling her lungs. Her heart, once restless, now beat in time with the world around her. There were no more questions, no more longings for things she could not have. There was only the present, the moment she stood in, the life she had built for herself in this small, quiet corner of the world. The peace that had eluded her for so long had finally settled into her bones, and she felt, for the first time, that she was exactly where she needed to be. The sky overhead was now a canvas of stars, each one a tiny, glowing reminder of the vastness of the universe. Isabelle looked up at them, her breath soft and steady, and felt a gentle smile curve across her lips. There were no grand revelations here, no sudden bursts of understanding. The stars, distant and untouchable, simply existed, their quiet light reaching out across the darkness, offering something inexplicable but beautiful. Isabelle knew, in that moment, that this was enough. She did not need to chase after anything, did not need to seek out answers that would only ever remain out of reach. The world, in all its vastness, had a rhythm of its own, and she, like the earth, had her place within it. She was not alone in her journey, nor was she an outsider. She was a part of it all, woven into the fabric of time and space, the past and the future, the known and the unknown. The silence around her was no longer empty. It was full of meaning, full of life. And as Isabelle turned away from the willow tree and walked slowly back through the garden, she realized that she had finally come full circle. The longing that had once driven her, the search for something more, had led her here, to this moment, to this stillness, to this peace. She no longer needed to wait for something to change. It had already changed. She had changed. The garden, the sky, the world, they would continue on, as they always had, in their quiet, constant rhythm. And Isabelle would continue, too, walking through her life with the quiet understanding that all she needed was already within her, already woven into the very fabric of her being. She no longer needed the answers. She no longer needed to know what came next. As the last light of the day faded into night, Isabelle took one final look at the horizon, where the earth met the sky in a soft, seamless line. There, just beyond the reach of her sight, was the future, vibrant, uncertain, and waiting. And though she could not see the path ahead, she knew, with a certainty that filled her heart with peace, that she would meet it when the time came, step by step, heartbeat by heartbeat. For now, though, there was only the quiet after the storm, the silence that spoke volumes, and the soft, eternal rhythm of the world that she had learned to trust. And that, for Isabelle, was more than enough.